Hey, this is Byron Summerdahl with Ackland Avenue. I'm joined by Nathaniel Holzman, Dante Dubon, and Juan Jose Guevara, and we're going to
Hello.
talk about some issues or questions about service-oriented architecture and microservices and monoliths and basically just answering Nathaniel's questions about that. Also, we're joined by Saul Mallorquin. So basically, if you don't know about us, Nathaniel is one of our product owners, and he is playing the role of a non-technical kind of product owner, and just has some questions about the differences between service-oriented architecture and microservice architecture and things like that. So Nathaniel, why don't you get us started with some good questions, and I'm going to
Okay.
make some coffee.
All right. Enjoy your coffee. Good morning. So, guys, basically, as part of Ackland's continuing focus on training, there's some great articles. The one was called REST APIs Backend, and one of the questions was, "What is service-oriented architecture?" Included a great link to a basic video that explained the history of architecture, starting with monolithic, where you had dumb terminals, dumb server, dumb computer terminals, and everything was on the mainframe back in the 70s and all the way up to today. But it stopped at service-oriented architecture, and I was like, wait a minute, we're actually a little beyond that. We're now in this microservices architecture. We're talking about that a lot. And what is the difference between service-oriented architecture and microservices architecture? That's the key question for today. And I wanted to sort of provide my thoughts and then hear what you guys had to say. So service-oriented architecture, it sounds like, based on what I've seen, and this is, again, I'm not a programmer, the service-oriented architecture was a great attempt to try and abstract the different services, the different things that we need to do in a program to different areas. The problem was that people took it and then abused it. In other words, it didn't actually get abstracted enough. It didn't get separated from the rest of the service. So I've got one big server with 5 services or more, but they're not discrete, and they're not. They're still interconnected. They're not separated enough. So if that server goes down, all my services fail. From a user perspective, that's a bad thing. Microservices sort of takes it to its logical conclusion, is what it sounds like, from what I understand, and says, look, all of the different services should be totally independent. They could be even programmed in different languages. I could have one in BASIC, one in COBOL, and one in C++.
And you're going old school.
Yeah, but I am old school. But the idea is that all of these services are totally independent. They could run on different platforms in different places, and as long as the system is talking to each other and working, it works. And if one part goes down, the rest don't fail, which I believe is one of the problems with like service-oriented architecture. But I don't think conceptually they're very different from each other. So that's my understanding of it, is that you could almost say they're the same, except that service-oriented architecture sort of went off in a wrong direction. And I don't know if that's true or not. So that's what I understand. And you guys are the experts. I've got 4 of you. So go ahead.
Once upon a time, I read an article that said that microservice is SOA in the right way, because service-oriented architecture, in fact, was a list of statements. It's not an architecture per se, only a list of intention that somebody, I don't remember the name of the author, write it and say, hey, this should be the principle that should guide the systems.
Sort of like agile.
Yes, sort of like an agile. In fact, it's a SOA manifest. I believe.
Oh, okay.
That is the name. The problem was that after that, some vendors like Oracle, Microsoft,
Microsoft.
PeopleSoft, etc., IBM, etc. They created great monoliths, and we are in the year, and we see that these monoliths have failed in every place. For example, I see in Honduras, I was a witness about one of these failures in a Honduras bank. They bought a complex solution from Oracle, and they built a great monolith to pass his system. And when comes the date to pass this to a new system, everything failed.
Mm.
So this is the situation. But the microservice has the same spirit than SOA, but in the right way.
Yes. Okay.
I've got a few little visuals I can show you. I won't bore you with the whole presentation, but I find some of the visuals in this little presentation to be kind of helpful, at least on a memorability standpoint. So imagine delta.com, and of course there's a lot going on in delta.com, and I don't know what their architecture is like, but if it's what Dante was describing, it's going to be something very similar to this.
Oh yes.
One gigantic monolith API and service. So then that's actually not even service-oriented architecture. Service-oriented architecture would say that you need to cut it up into smaller sumo wrestlers like this.
Right.
So but even this, this is a customer's monolith. This is a customer service monolith. This is an accounting monolith, and so you're slicing the system into pieces that are almost by role. That's the way a lot of teams will decide to slice their system, trying to do SOA.
It's based on, so when we're talking about it, sorry to interrupt, when we're talking about a service-oriented architecture, they're often thinking of in terms of users, because you've got customers, customer service, accounting, user roles, or...
There's nothing that says that,
okay,
but it's just the way that I've seen it implemented.
Okay, fair enough.
But notice here at the bottom, there's only one database.
Right.
Yeah?
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Maybe Dante's having some problems.
Yeah, I think he's having some problems with the internet.
Okay. So notice here at the bottom, there's only one database. So that's part of where you end up with some of your problems, where an entire system can go down. Just imagine if your schema gets messed up for customers, then it's going to get messed up for everything else. There are lots of different ways for this to mess up.
Right. With one database, you end up with one central point of failure.
Also, if you make one change to one piece of the customer, maybe this still being a monolith, still being a sumo wrestler, it might be a pretty big service with maybe 100 endpoints doing 100 different things that customers need to do. Finding flights and booking and all the different ways to book flights, one way, multi-city, things like that. It's still large, fairly large. So Microservices comes along and tries to do something like this, where it slices it up into more like functional areas, or what we call bounded contexts. So we borrow the term bounded context from the world of DDD, or domain-driven design. And so a bounded context is really just a context that has boundaries. So flights is a context, booking is a context, your miles that you can accumulate, your login, your check-in, logging even can be a context. So all of these small contexts make for better slices. But then notice there's a difference, one more difference in the graphics here. How many databases do we have?
Yeah, 5.
5, one for each service. That's a big difference between SOA and typical microservices. Now, there's nothing, like Dante was saying, there's nothing in SOA that says you have to have one database. It's just the way it normally is implemented. So microservices comes along and actually applies some rules, some ideas to the concept. And pretty much everywhere you see microservices described and depicted, you're going to see this little database icon on each service.
Sure.
So that's a big difference.
Yes.
Well, go ahead, Dante.
Another thing that is valuable to mention is that there is not a single definition about SOA, because every vendor has his own definition.
Yeah, right. I was doing a little bit of research and I found that it's like SOA is not ubiquitous language. Everyone's got their own idea of what SOA means and what it means to them. Oracle has one definition, Microsoft has a different one. I'm like, this is a mess.
Yes. Well, the same happens with the microservices too, because when you talk about microservices, you always come to the question of how big is a microserver, how small should it be?
Right.
So there's not really a consensus of how are things.
You can look at Martin Fowler is kind of like the god of software development. You could picture whatever you could consider what he says to be kind of like the thing you should follow, and he says to size it with your bounded context. Well, then you get to go back to domain-driven design and say how big should a bounded context be, and but at least there's some established opinions.
Yes. One of the things that SOA proposes is the ubiquitous of the service, that we should not be aware about the location of the service, right? And the vendors come with a kind of solution a little expensive, like the enterprise bus. Oracle has its enterprise bus, Microsoft has its enterprise bus, but the problem with that solution is I see this kind of solution in practice is that when you apply this service bus, you come with this kind of diagram, because they attempt to wrap all the service that you have in your enterprise and put in the middle this solution from this vendor and connect it. So it's like a bridge. This bridge comes with this explosion, because in the end you came with a lot of service and you lost the power of management, because these services are centralized, and you have a single point of failure. That is a problem, because if this service went down, well, you lost everything.
In a so I might have missed something. In a service-oriented architecture, though, aren't the services supposed to be unique and separated?
That depends on that in the enterprise. Yes. Remember that we don't have a clear definition in the enterprise implementing how they want, and remember that all the solutions are sold by enterprise like Microsoft, Oracle, IBM, so they sell in the best way can. Then the clients spend more money.
Yeah.
So ours would depend on that.
And also, you have to remember that anything that we say is really only informed by what we've seen,
sure,
and what we've read about. And in typical SOA implementation, it usually when somebody says we have a SOA system, it's really that they have a service, and their systems are hitting a service. And maybe they even feel really proud that they're using SOA because they have two services, like more than one.
Yeah.
So once they're using more than one service, they have service-oriented architecture. But then you look at the database. How many databases are you using? You ask, and they're almost always using one.
One database.
Yeah, which serves them all. There are exceptions to that, but like we said, there's no. It's Wild West. There's no set rhyme or reason to it.
Sure. So why would an enterprise switch to a service-oriented architecture at all? Because it sounds like it's just a rehash of a system that already existed with the N tier.
Well, it's a good idea. Anytime you can chop things up into smaller pieces and deploy them separately, it's a good thing. So several services with one database is still better than one big, huge service with one database.
Okay.
So you're already getting some benefit there. It's just that the microservices idea tries to take it to another level, which is really the level that probably the service-oriented architecture author was trying to go in the first place.
Yeah.
And it's that, like Dante said, it's SOA done right. But a refocusing of your ideas in how it should be chopped.
Yeah.
One of the main differences also is the concept of error. On the microservice world, the error should be embraced. Because we are talking about the microservice that should react positively to an error. So the microservice should be healthy in a case of error. In the SOA way, the error is a catastrophe.
What you're talking about though is dependencies. So if you have one service and it depends on another service and they're trying to communicate, and for some reason there's something that is cutting that communication, then microservice 1 should, when it gets that error, it should degrade gracefully. And that is definitely a tenet of microservices.
Correct. Okay.
So just expanding a little bit more, microservices is more like a specialization of the SOA. The main difference is that you can split the logic on your system, the domain logic, and all the stuff in different services. But if these services are not independently deployable, then you might have a SOA system, but it is not a microservice system. Because that's the point. When you have a piece that is independently deployable, then you go to the point of having a microservice system.
Which actually brings up one of the problems with microservices, which is deployment. By having microservices, you really gain a lot in resiliency of your system, or of being able to let parts of your system have different versions from other parts, interdependent. Yeah, you could use different technology. You can deploy things separately, but there's a larger cost in the DevOps area, which is why things like Docker exist, and sadly for .NET, there's not really much out there unless you go with Mono, but that's coming at some point. We're gonna fix that problem eventually, but yeah, it's harder to deploy, because instead of just deploying one thing, you're deploying maybe 20 things.
Sure.
And that's for me that's a problem, because it doesn't matter if you have a service with its own database and you have all these, I don't know, 5 services with their own databases. But if you need to deploy them all at once, then I would say that you have an ASOA, but with different databases, because you have a monolithic deployment process.
Yeah.
And that's not the point of having microservices.
Yeah, they've got to be separately, independently deployable.
Yeah. If you get to the point that even if you have this service here with its own database, but you have to deploy them all at once, then you have a monolithic deployment, and that's bad.
You just have a more expensive monolith.
Yeah.
Would you guys say that SOA is that microservices seems to have a greater sense of greater overhead and is a little more expensive up front, but more robust after you start using it?
I would. I want to let the other guys answer that too. I would compare the savings, the monetary savings, to test-driven development, maintainability, clean code, a lot of the things that we follow as a company. The payoff is not today. It's not upfront. It's over time, when you find that you have to go back and refactor or fix a bug or add a feature.
Sure.
Maintainability. So that's where the savings come in big time using our methods. And I would say the same thing. Microservices for us is really just a kind of a natural manifestation of how we normally do things anyway. In our code, in the minute or the unit level, we're trying to keep our code independent, encapsulated, decoupled from other things. Dependencies going in the right directions, and so if you go up to the macro level, then services should be the same. And so microservices is the embodiment of that, at least that philosophy that we live by day to day. And I would say that the savings, just like with TDD and other things, is kind of like an overtime. Over time, you're going to feel it, and probably only for larger systems, because littler systems probably are not going to feel the payoff. But if anybody else has something to add to that, go ahead.
Yeah, I have to add something. It's like an evolution of these distributed systems, Antonio. For example, as if you saw the diagram that Dante showed to us, was the first solution of the enterprise development, like Oracle, IBM, Microsoft.
Sure.
So they tried to remove the developer and just add super users and diagram everything, and add things, and the developers, the only thing they do is connect servers with another server, but the logic is in a diagram. But the problem is that you end up with a big diagram that is impossible to understand. And so there comes the other side of the development, that are the craftsmanships, the guys like Martin Fowler that doesn't believe in the enterprise development, right? So the first thing that they proposed was SOA. I have seen a lot of these guys that are not good on the enterprise side, but are good on this development, this kind of development that we do. And they start doing these things, but still having some problems. The databases or the code comes really high, or the API goes high, but we have TDD and all this stuff, but the code still be just too big for enterprise systems. So there it comes the next evolution, that is microservices, that you have those little things and you only have to code the small things, and the code is really small, less test and less maintenance in the time. So that's the evolution that I have seen on this distributed system architecture.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
One thing that we've only mentioned a little bit, actually, I don't know if we've mentioned scalability yet, but scalability for microservices is way more than even its SOA implementations.
And the cost.
Yeah, can you explain that, Dante?
Okay, with SOA, you need to buy a bigger box,
Yeah,
bigger service.
Yeah. And we should say the typical implementations of SOA, because it's just a concept. But the typical implementations, you have to buy a bigger box, because each service requires more memory, whereas microservices require much less memory. And if one of your microservices all of a sudden starts getting a lot of traffic, like it's Christmas season at Delta.com, and your flight API is getting pegged, well then scale it. Scale just that, not everything, just that.
To spin up all the services.
Y'all want to see another graphic?
Sure.
Let's see if I've.
While you're doing that, I've got one more question. Maybe one of the guys can help, and that is when dealing with, is it recommended to switch if you've got a very cutting edge business and they're like, well, we were SOA, but now we want to go with microservices because that's the new thing and that's the hotness, and we need to have microservices. And you're like, okay, but is that a smart thing for a business to do? Is try and migrate their entire enterprise level systems from SOA over to microservices?
I would say that it depends on the implementation of SOA.
Okay.
Because if the implementation of SOA has a lot of problems, like a singular monolithic server, like Vista, for example, it could be better to begin a migration to a more focused service like microservice. But only depends on that, I believe.
Yeah, I would say that it's it's not something crazy because when you have like an SOA, then the next step is microservices. So you just need to split things more. But it is a risky thing to do because if you messed up in implementation, then you really messed up. So I would say that it is something smart to do, but it is also very risky. So you have to do it well.
You got to calculate things. You
Yeah.
gotta find a happy you gotta find that threshold at which you start to either save money or make money.
Mm-hmm.
You gotta find where you break even.
Yes.
But like I mentioned, it's not for everything. For smaller projects, it's
Right.
not. You might have a micro project, so you only need one service. It's not really a monolith.
I wanted to talk about the pricing also. If you're doing something small, I wouldn't bother to do the microservices because sometimes that project is small enough to be a microservice. So from the cost perspective, don't bother doing that from the beginning unless you know that you're gonna need it.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yes. In fact, in the Subworld Radar, they talk about a thing called microservice envy, because not every system should be designed in microservice way.
Yeah.
Here's a quick little graphic to show how there's could be some scalability, and I would say infinite scalability with CQRS when you mash up CQRS with microservices. One of the questions that you always have to ask if you've got several services is, how are the services going to communicate? One possibility is to have one API. So separate the idea of an API with a service. So the API is just the HTTP layer. So you could possibly have one massive API with no problem. APIs are thin. You could have one API for the delta.com website, but then have separate services that are not necessarily APIs that communicate just by pulling things off of a queue. Well, then if you do it that way, and this is what we did with Rewardle, pretty much what we did with Rewardle, you've got command workers, which is basically your service, pulling things off of a queue, and one of those command workers might be the flights command worker. One of them might be the miles. One of them might be for accounts. So those are your services. Well, if your flights command worker gets pegged, then you can very easily scale just that one up and add servers for that microservice. Also, if for some reason your HTTP layer, your API layer is getting pegged, just scale that.
Mm-hmm.
No big deal. You could split the API into smaller pieces also, or you could leave it big. That's actually a really easy decision to make because it's easy to chop that up later. Because there's no business logic in that. It's all inside of your command worker and your service. So this right here is one really cool way that it's more complicated. So you got to find that threshold, right, where you got to find where you break even, or when you start making money. But this provides infinite scalability.
Okay.
All because you chose to go with microservices.
Cool.
Cool. So do you feel educated, Nathaniel?
I do. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I've got another meeting I got to jump into.
Yeah, me too.
Really
All right. Well, thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.